Thanks. Hey everybody, thanks for coming. My name is Brian Ouellette, and I'm the freshman coach at Seago. This is coming up to my fourth year. I was hired by Matt as the parent of a former player of his, and you can ask him later on the side why he hired me with no experience, but he did, and I was really happy that he did. So these first few years have been a real learning experience, and when Coach asked me to pass along what I've learned, I thought that was a really nice opportunity to let people know what's going on with us. So we have a little bit of a presentation here. Let me share. So we're going to start with talking about just overall program development, because I think in ninth grade basketball, you're sort of in the middle between middle school and the varsity team. And I think the major part of the freshman coach's job is to shepherd the experience of the players from middle school to high school. During middle school, they absolutely set their pecking order about who the starters are and who the best players are. But I'm sure all of you know that the best players in middle school are often the ones that have already matured early and don't have much more growing to do. So, you know, some of my job is designed to make that transition easier. So one of the things that we've done, and some of this is pre-COVID versus during COVID. So maybe together we can figure out how to do this during COVID. But previously to COVID, I think that one of the most important things is to get in touch with those eighth graders before they even get to the high school. So I try to attend games, get to know names, try to match up players with the parents in the stands. Sometimes you can see which parents are more involved or less involved, or take it more seriously than others. And then I think it's really important to get them in May. In May, we start some really informal open gyms. I use that time to just kind of look at the dynamics of the group, you know, who are the leaders and who are the players that shoot the most. And but my secret plan is to get everybody's contact information from those open gyms. You get the players' contact information, but even more importantly, you get the parents' contact information. During those summer workouts, you can ask players to bring in, you know, who didn't play basketball this year, but, you know, is a really good athlete, and ask them to come to the open gyms and watch them play. I think that every now and then you find a hidden player who hasn't played that really wants to. And then the other thing that the May contacts do for us is they allow me to get them all involved in summer basketball. I think maybe you come from a district where summer basketball is like a club where only certain people are invited. And I think that the May contact time allows me to encourage as many players as possible to get involved in summer basketball. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but in ninth grade, I'm trying to assemble a roster that has many players that have potentially some ability to help out at the varsity level. So I'm sort of a big tent type of program where when we go to get up to JV, they're a little bit of a smaller tent, and then we're trying to call it down to a varsity roster. I think that it's super important to communicate with parents early and often. One of the things I think has been a real strength in the freshman program is that I tend to over-inform parents about what's going on with the program. I send very long emails that I call the nerd journal, which is just basketball things that I want parents to watch for. That's both during summer basketball and then into tryouts too. My feeling on that is ninth grade players, especially boys, if you have ninth grade boys, you know what I'm talking about, are not really in charge of their lives. And they don't drive. Their priorities, if you remember yourself back when you were 14 years old, are not always on the right things. So I communicate not just with the players, but also with the parents, because I want the parents to know when the workout times are. I can't tell you how many times I've had where the openings for our workouts, where the kids can enter in their names for workouts remain empty for a while. I'll send out an email to the parents saying, hey, the workout schedule is open, and then immediately get about 5 or 6 kids signed up because their mom gets on the phone with them and says, you better sign up right now. So I think communicating with parents, especially at the freshman level, is very important. In the past couple of years, what we've done then is our JV coach communicates primarily through the players with some contact with parents, and then the varsity coach, Matt, tends to communicate directly with players as much as possible. So I think that's a nice progression from let's help these kids get involved in the program to it's really the players' responsibility to make sure they're at the right place at the right time. And I think another program development type thing that's very important is that I get to set program expectations early. And of course, there's things like force baseline and defense, and here's how we run our offensive break. There's things like that. But I think that program expectations are bigger than that. And as a freshman coach, it's my job to make sure that when they get to Matt at the varsity level, that he doesn't have to worry about some things. So for example, in our first away game, we take the bus. Before they get off the bus, I tell my boys to put all their headphones away, take their hoods off. When we walk into the building, if you see anybody that's wearing the colors or the shirt of the school that we're visiting, it's your job to make eye contact and to say hello or thanks for having us. Anybody that opens the door, opens the locker room for you, every single person needs to say thank you to that person. As soon as whenever we get off the bus, we're saying thank you to the bus driver, because I think that sets, first of all, a nice impression for the other conference opponents that we play. But it also gives them a sense of pride, like this is us, this is what we do. And when they get to Matt, then we don't have to worry about little kind of soft skills like that. We're not going to walk in like, we're the toughest bunch in the world. We're going to walk in like we're very happy to be there, and then we're going to beat you on the court. Okay. And then the last thing in this section, before I kind of throw it out there and ask if anybody has any questions or would like to contribute to the conversation, is cuts and assembling a roster. It's really difficult in ninth grade because in the same way that the ninth grade players aren't really in charge of their schedule, I'm not totally in charge of my roster. And the players that have the most offensive skill are often players that might be candidates to move up. So then I have players that have really never shot the ball or had any offensive responsibilities having to step up. We need to figure out who can play point guard, and a lot of times it's the point guard that gets moved up. Do we have any size? 2 years ago, I had a team that had no player above 5'10", and very little skill. So how do we keep that team involved and involved in the program and varsity contributors? So the things that I've discovered about assembling, first of all, making cuts, are that everybody gets at least 2 days of tryouts. And at the end of our second day, we start player evaluations. It's really important, I think, to have measurable, like empirical data. So we do simple things like an 800-meter run, and we do backboard touches, and we do line sprints, and we just try to make sure free throws and three-pointers. We try to make sure that we have numbers for everybody. Everybody gets their own sheet. I meet with everybody on that at the end of the second day of practice, and then I'll make cuts then. That's always a tough time. Last year was actually the first time I had to do it, and I cut 4 boys and 2 of them cried. So it's tough to end a kid's basketball dream for that season on their very first day of basketball, freshman basketball. So, and then another issue that I found is a question every year is how many players to keep. We want to be a Big Ten. We want to have as many players as possible, but every player over that 9th player really cuts into everybody's playing time. So I think with 12 players, the average number of minutes is less than a half a game. And of course, you want to give your best players the most time. So what I found is that 12 is an ideal number because then you have 2 groups of 6 in case somebody's absent or injured or whatever. 13 is tough. And if you keep that 13th player, you need to make sure that he's a point guard. That's somebody that can play point. because then you have a sub for your point guard that can go in on either one of the squads. So roster construction is a little bit of a patchwork job at the freshman level, but we always try to make sure that if we have that extra player, that he's a point guard. So that's what I have for program development. Does anybody have any tips for anybody or some questions for us? Or I'm especially interested in how you, your summer before ninth grade and preseason type of activities to get kids involved in the program.
I'll throw a couple things on the table. One, you talked about cutting the kid and it's the end of kind of their basketball dreams. In that like ninth grade or below, I think it's important to chat with that kid and that parent. And I'm already having those discussions now. Basketball is not just a couple months sport anymore. It's year round. You can still get better, in these travel leagues that are within 30 miles of our house. So the dream doesn't have to end today. You're just ending potentially a dream for 20 days. I have a question, size of teams that you've kept. Do you find practices get wonky when we start to get over 10, 11, 12, and you've decided to keep that 13th, 14th player because of whatever reason? Do you prefer a certain size roster? Nothing to do with playing time. I'm not worried about the minutes. I'm talking about the actual practice itself.
My preference is 12. That being said, most years I've kept 13. Sometimes that's just due to I really, really like that kid and he represents what we want the program to be. I think each year that I've coached, I've taken aside that 12th and 13th player and said, I can't promise you a certain amount of minutes. Those are the kids that it's very rare that a kid doesn't play in a game. Matt's set the expectation that everybody in ninth grade basketball plays during a game, if they've earned it during practice. And, I've had games where there's been a player or two that hasn't played, and that involves some, bridge reassembly afterwards because, they're always very disappointed. And so my preference is 12. I think 11 gets, first of all, it's not enough for ninth grade basketball, in my opinion, but 11 gets a little touchy because, we always have somebody who's kind of feeling sick or down or injured or have an issue with grades or that kind of thing. So, once you get down to 10, then it's really close to not being able to run 5-on-5 things. So I prefer 12.
Coach, if you real quick, you talk about developing some of the soft skills with the players. Are the kids receptive to this, or is it something that's brand new to them? You're talking about looking them in the eye. I mean, we think about being on cell phones, and now we're virtual so much of the time with school versus with COVID. It might be a little different. But how do they take the soft skills? Is it a fight with them, or is it pretty smooth transition?
It's actually really easy because they come in, ninth graders come in very wide-eyed. They come in, first of all, they really want to make the team. And so they're very receptive to the kinds of things, especially if you put it in the context of this is what Bulldog basketball players do. It really kind of sets the, that's our gang and that's what our gang does. Another thing I forgot to mention that has been really successful is that we will practice bench conduct preseason. So we'll actually set the clock up, set chairs up, and we'll talk to the boys about where they sit, what kind of plays that they stand up and cheer for, what they do during timeouts, when's a good time to get a drink of water, because I want the boys to all know that our bench reflects what we value as a team. So I always blame you too, Matt. I always say when Coach Dennis is in the gym, he does not watch the players on the floor. He watches the bench. And so if you're body language is poor, if you're not involved mentally in the game, those things show up right away. And they show up on film too, depending on the angle of the camera. So I find the players to be very receptive to that kind of thing. As they get older, they get a little bit more independent, and you kind of have to revisit some of that stuff. The headphone issue alone is one that sometimes they kind of think, oh, I'm done with freshman basketball, now I can put my headphones back on. But I find them to be very receptive.
All right, I'll go ahead and let you move on to the next portion you have. If we have time, I have one more question about parents, but I wanted you to get the rest of it first.
All right, so and obviously assembling a roster is not the only thing we have to do. We actually have to build some players. So here are some of the key things that I've discovered in freshman basketball that either are super important because they're not very good at it, or just for our style of play. So the first thing I've discovered is Coach Dennis gives me a lot of freedom to do the things that I like to do. We conference a lot about how to accomplish certain things. I've noticed that part of my job is to translate skills down to the 9th grade level. There are things that Coach Dennis expects of his players at the varsity level. He has given us a schedule of things that he wants the players to be able to do. And a large part of what I've discovered is that I need to refine his expectations into chunks that the boys can understand and actually physically accomplish. My favorite example is pick and roll defense, where our defense wants to be a hard hedging team. And I went to Matt preseason, I said, 9th graders can't hard hedge. So we talked about, what is it that we can expect of 9th graders that then can translate upward to JV and then upward to varsity level. And what I settled on last year was at 9th grade level, we will not be screened. So there's certain defensive techniques and communication calls that we make, because my standard for the boys in 9th grade is that we will not be ever screened. One of the ways that I have reinforced that is in practices, when we're practicing pick and roll defense, is if the defender of the screener let me say it in a different way. If a player on the perimeter gets screened, the defender of that screener runs, because it's his fault that player got screened. So let's say they're doing a kind of a pick and roll up on the wing. Our player is yelling up, 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 up when he sees the screen coming, because we want our player to then step up into the offensive player and make sure that he goes baseline and doesn't use the screen. We are yelling up, 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 up. If the player doesn't yell that in a way and communicate that in a way that results in our player being screened on the perimeter, I would stop practice. That player would run, and I would get another player in there. And it was just a lap, but boy, those guys really learn fast. When they see a guy step up to set a screen, they are yelling and screaming. Luckily, we had a couple of really good perimeter defenders that saved them from running a bunch of times. But that's just a small example of translating a skill down to the 9th grade level that then allows them to progress up into a varsity level of that skill. Communicating, and this is true, I'm sure, of every level everywhere, but 9th graders are horrible at communicating. And our defense and offense is predicated on it. So we start very early being obnoxiously and comically loud about things. They all feel stupid when they're doing it. We're in an empty gym. But one of the things I tell them is, guys, the gym is empty during practice. It's also almost empty during a game. So you're going to feel silly communicating as loud as you need to. But pre-COVID on a Friday night in Otsego, you've got over 1,000 people in the gym. We're practicing and internalizing a skill that's absolutely necessary at the varsity level. The band is there, the cheerleaders are there, the whole crowd is there. They need to be able to hear you over that. So we practice very early in the season being comically and obnoxiously loud about the calls that we make. And then we constantly have to reinforce it, just constantly reinforcing it because they'll forget. Playing with speed is I would say the most surprising thing for the players is how fast they have to play in order to succeed. A lot of the players are used to kind of drifting the way they do when they're playing 5-on-5, and that's just not successful basketball, especially at the varsity level. So one of the, if I could just explain one drill that I do that I've really been happy with how it teaches our boys to play with speed. In my first year, we would run a typical 3-on-2, 2-on-1 drill back. So 3 players would go down, be defended by 2 players, and it'd be 2-on-1 on the way back. And as I was watching that drill over the course of the year, I thought, how many times during a game do you have 2 players waiting for you in the lane while 3 players have 3/4 of the court to run up and do something? And then you get caught in the possessions where it's 2 or 3 or 4 passes, nobody can get a shot off, and then you just say, forget it, come back. So I adjusted that drill to what I call Bulldog 3-on-2. And what that is we start at the foul line extended, going towards the long side of the court. And the players with the ball start at the foul line extended. There's 2 players that start at the hashes, where the hashes used to be. And we say go. And those 3 players are sprinting with the ball. The 2 defenders are sprinting back. So we're working on our transition defense at the same time. As soon as any player or the ball crosses half court, the other 2 offensive players and the other 3 defensive players start running from the foul line extended. So they don't have 2 or 3 passes to make a basket. We're trying to take advantage of that 3-on-2 within 1 pass or 1 move with the basketball, because those other guys are coming. And I found that it's very good at speeding up their decision making. You can see who can sprint down the court, who has a reason to sprint down the court, and who drifts. And then after that, we play another possession back. So we always start at the same end of the court. I really prefer that because when they know that those other 5 players are coming, you'll see people revert to things that we haven't coached them. Well, we can see who freezes with the ball. And there's a lot of coaching points that we can give once that possession's over. So the last thing is playing with intensity and focus. You know, you're dealing with 14 and 15-year-old boys, so they don't have a ton of focus. And playing with intensity all the time can be an issue. The one thing that I found that is the most successful of that is we spend a fair amount of time of our scrimmaging time playing what I call end game. So we'll split the guys up. Many days I let them pick their own teams. We'll pick a couple of captains and they'll pick teams. We'll set the clock for something like 53 seconds. We'll decide one team is ahead or behind. It always starts with a 1-on-1, and then we're just playing complete with foul calls, everything. When the players feel like they're in a game that's being officiated, that's timed, foul shots, if they get fouled, the intensity really ramps up. And they get mad when they lose. They're really upset when they lose and when players make mistakes. So I found that end game is a really effective way to spend half of our scrimmage time because the intensity is so high. And the number one thing I like about it, especially Troy, as you're talking about with 12 players, is that I can pull a player off, and while the game is going on, I can talk to that player about what he wasn't doing that we've coached all year long in the game. So we talk to the players about, here's what we do in practice. We have to translate that into the games, and the players that play the most are the ones that do these specific things in a game. Well, you'll see all the time the play breaks down, the concepts break down, the techniques break down when you're in a game, and things are frantic. So playing end game during scrimmages allows us to really ramp up the intensity of our practices, especially near the end. So that's what I have for skill development. I would love to hear what everybody else finds works for them, because I'm all ears. So I'll open it up to whoever has a question or a contribution to discussion.
We have a ratio as you look at your plan each day, a ratio where you're deciding this amount of time I'm going to put towards ball handling, this much amount of time towards team defense, individual defense, the actual running of plays? Like, do you have an equation that you kind of go into the week with?
That's a great question. That to me totally depends on when during the season you're talking about. We do a fair amount of skills during that tryout week and maybe in the first couple of weeks of practice. Some of the skill work, I sometimes will de-emphasize that until mid-season when we need to revisit it. My feeling is that players improve those skills the most during the off season. So generally speaking, my preseason is teaching one of our two offensive concepts, teaching our offensive break, and teaching our man-to-man defense. I don't put in a press until Christmas time because I need 4 or 5 games to figure out if they can play defense. And when we press them, they stop playing half-court defense on a lot of possessions. So no, Troy, don't tell your guys that because I don't want them to think that we're not going to press them before Christmas. So
You have nothing to worry about, man. You have nothing to worry about. I can assure you of that.
So as far as the ratio goes, that's a great question. A lot of it depends on where the team is. Matt will tell you 2 years ago, I had a team that just, how do you say this, Matt? Had very little skill.
That's how you say it.
As an example, I was at a loss. Here's a little funny story. 2 years ago, my team won 1 game, and that game was a miracle. In that game, we went scoreless for 11 minutes, and we won it. And so at one point, at many points in the season, but at this particular point, Matt, taking pity on me, said, "Hey, you want me to stay after practice and we'll work on a couple of things?" And I said, that would be awesome because they were tired of hearing my voice. So I think that was pretty close to mid-season, wasn't it, Matt, when you stayed after?
Yeah.
And so Matt was planning on staying for 15 or 20 minutes, and we planned to practice accordingly. And Matt ended up staying almost an hour, and all we worked on was pivoting. Almost the only thing we worked on was with the ball, where you put it, and pivoting. And this was mid-season with that team. So I think, Troy, with that team, we spent a lot of time on skills. But I think that was at the expense of understanding how our offense and defense works as in a team aspect. And, in the end, I think that was okay because those boys didn't have the skills necessarily to implement our offensive and defensive schemes anyway. So we were really just working hard on individual skills that year. This past year, I had a very coachable group. So we would spend, I would say, 30 to 35 minutes on ball handling, shooting, some individual skills, individual defense. And then we would go into more whole group conceptual type things. And then I let them play a lot. We played a lot, about probably 35 to 40 minutes per practice was spent either half court concepts or playing full court.
So of that group, then it sounded like they had we'll just say a lot of growth opportunity, right? They weren't capped at their potential. So you did a ton of fundamentals, probably different ratio than you would normally do. It's been 2 years. How many of those kids, I guess they would be going onto the varsity team then this year, right? They would be 11th graders potentially. How many of those kids do you think will end up making that varsity roster? You did this extra investment. Did it save 2 or 3 of them? Yeah,
I think that's fair. I had the 2 players that played up that year. So those are part of that graduating class. And then I could see 3 of them. Matt, does that sound about right? Maybe 2 or 3?
Yeah, I think that there are 3 kids who will contribute as juniors this year off of that team, and that we've got the 2 we brought up, and then we've got 3 that will contribute in some way, and then a 4th to give us 6 out of that class, but he didn't play until his JV year.
Oh, that's right. I'm still mad at him for that.
Yeah, which he would have changed the dynamic of your team quite a bit. But yeah, I think that just from going on what he said, the players needed to know the basics of the game before they could ever get to any of the higher level stuff. And you did a good job of teaching that, because when they got to the JV level, they certainly ran more things and had more options in their offense because of the skills that they possessed then. You couldn't have done that in your freshman year. They would have been confused and not be able to perform.
Yeah, we had 1 baseline out of bounds play that year that we ran, and that was it. So with other years I've had 4 or 5, but that year there was 1.
But no, so I like this story. I think that this is a great story that could be told to both the parents and the athletes, saying, hey, look, we're going to sacrifice maybe going from 1 to 3 wins. Instead, we're going to focus more on development to help you in a couple of years from now. And it sounds like that's what you did. And you actually harvested some talent out of a below average or a way upside group of kids. And I think that's a great story. I like it.
Yeah. And one thing I say, Troy, is when Brian knows that the evaluation of him is not based upon the number of wins that he gets at the freshman level. And I think that's super important for coaches to be able to feel comfortable, like, okay, we need to focus on this area, even though it's not going to put another check in the win column. And then he can go out and do his job, what I've asked him to do. And that's really to develop the players. But if they feel like they've got to get the wins, and I feel like this sometimes at the middle school level, it's like, man, if we just press all the time, we could beat kids. Well, you could, but pressing and winning in middle school is at developing what they need at the next level. So for Brian, it's more about the development. So when he says he doesn't press, I like that, because I think we're focusing on the stuff that's going to get us wins down the road.
Well, I think that speaks to the parent communication too. Like I try to make it clear from the beginning to parents that the lineups and the rotations that we put in place sometimes change due to the course of the game, but sometimes we're working on bigger things than whether we're going to win that particular game. So I try to repeat that during the season, that this is what I'm asking the boys to do for this week or 2 weeks, to the exclusion of winning sometimes. And, you know, that's hard for parents to get to. I've been in the crowd watching that happen, and it's very difficult to say, well, why don't they just put so-and-so in? And, you know, that's hard. You know, an exception being, we had 1 game last year where we had come off of, I think it was 4 losses of 5 points or less in a row. And that was one of the games where one of the boys didn't play, and I felt like we needed a win. We were close at the end of the game. And that led to a long conversation with that player and that parent about why that boy didn't play in that game. And, you know, I had to tell the parent, you know, this is not what Coach Dennis wants out of the program, and it happened, and it won't happen again. However, here's why it did happen, and this is what your player could do to get better. So that there's a lot of communicating at the 9th grade level.
Well, that leads me to the question I had for you earlier, Brian, was how do you handle parents? Because they obviously are in control of the freshman kids' entire universe in terms of transporting them places, allowing them to do things, paying for, you know, participation fees, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So then you get this parent who's upset that they're not playing, or they're upset at something that's going on. And I think the kid probably is the first one to hear it, mm-hmm. but eventually it gets to you as the coach. What's your process for kind of recognizing what's going on and then dealing with it with the player and the parent both?
Well, the players get preseason evaluations, and then they get midseason and end of the season evaluations from me. I do put those on paper, but I don't give the paper to the player because I find that sort of like report cards, the parents aren't really interested in the context of it as much as they are counting their scores, like what are they best at or what are they worst at, like how many goods do they have or whatever. So my first message to parents as far as the player development goes is your player will always know why he or she is playing and why somebody else is playing above them or why somebody's playing behind them. They'll always know that. So the first step is with the player. And that being said, I try to make sure that each, if it's not week, it's every couple of weeks, we set weekly or biweekly goals for what we're trying to accomplish as a team. I ask the players to, I ask the parents to watch from the stands for certain things to happen so that the parent can have the conversation with the kid of, oh, you know, you're supposed to be forcing that guy to the baseline. I noticed you let him come middle. You know, those kind of conversations are the ones I loved having with my son. And so the really involved basketball parents, I think, enjoy those conversations. As far as player issues go, I have a really strong feeling about this particular issue in that if the question is coming from the player, then the player should come and talk to me about it. So the parent should encourage the player to come and talk to me about it. And I've had many players come and talk to me about things. If the question is coming from the parent, then I firmly believe that I do not want them to force the kid to go talk to me about something that they don't have a question about. I think that puts the child in a very difficult position. It puts me in a difficult position because I'm not really talking to the person that wants the answer. And then I'm relying on that player to communicate that back to his parent in a way maybe that he'd interpreted it wrong. So I make it clear to the parents that if they have a question for me that's coming from the parent, that they should contact me directly, and I'd be happy to talk to them about it. And, you know, the truth is most of the time that parents want their time to talk, and so I let them talk. I think it's important that freshman coach never try to defend what happened, and instead explain the context of where something happened. And, you know, the next, I think my focus as a coach is to say, okay, this is our plan moving forward. Because parents across the board only want two things. They want to know that they know your child, that you know that their child, and that you have a plan for their success. So if the parents have an issue and they come to me, I can tell them that I know their kid, here's what we're working on, here's what I've seen, and this is what we're doing moving forward, because going back to the incident has no value at all. There's no productivity in rehashing what happened. We want to talk about moving forward. So.
Perfect. That's I think a great thing that at your level and really at all levels, that's a good way to look at it. Who's asking the question and who's the question coming from. So Coach O,